Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick screencast here looking at a couple of sample essays that I've selected. So right out the gate, when I look at this one, I notice that they do not have the margins justified. Let's take a look at the thesis, and I'll be making some comments as we go along. The Cold War left a lasting impression. So right now, I'm questioning what this means. I don't know what a lasting impression means on U.S. politics because politicians desired an anti-communist country. So I get where the student is coming from. I get the point, but they definitely need to word this differently. They also want to make sure they identify those politicians, and they also want to address the politics. Maybe give me some policies, maybe give me some speeches that support the points that are trying to be made at this particular point. As I read this, so I didn't even get out of the first sentence, and already I have some issues. Looking at the rubric, I probably would be somewhere here at this point. So I'm a little confused at the moment. After the Cold War, so okay, I don't know, like there's a weird timing there. After the Cold War, the nation had, are we talking about World War II? The nation had an overall dislike and hatred toward communism. So this, okay, is false. I mean, we could go back to 1917 with the Russian Revolution, so I have some concerns about that. Led to numerous amount of changes in the political world. When you're writing like this, you want to make sure you give me examples. Give me examples of those changes that you're talking about. Are we talking about the Red Scare? Are we talking about the Sacco Vanzetti case? What exactly are we talking about in this political world? You want to make sure you are explaining those items. Their increase. Okay, so now we're transitioning to Truman, who was the president at the time. So at the time, it's vague. So now we're talking about after the Cold War and at the time. So guess I have to have an understanding of when these dates are. And wanted the government to cover all areas of problems. So again, all areas of problem would also be attentive to Soviet and communist beliefs. I don't know what that means. So Truman wants people to be attentive to the Soviet Union and communist beliefs. Well, how so? How do we know that? Did he issue a speech? Do we have a document? Do we have an executive order? We're missing some stuff here. Keep in mind, they're talking about U.S. politics and they're talking about politicians, but at this point, they really haven't said anything specific as far as what was done. There are many increased tensions all around the world. Okay, so now we're going back to the world. I thought we were talking about domestic issues in the United States, and now we're addressing around the world due to the dislike towards the Soviets. So now we're talking about two different things. I don't know at this point if this is about domestic issues. I don't know if this is about global issues. Was monitored closeness. Mainly, there were a well-known rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union's allies of the U.S. were conflicted whether they should take up trade with either of the two nations. If this is a potential thesis point, if you want to talk about the non-alignment movement and you want to talk about trade and how globally nations were put in a position where they either had to pick the capitalist side or the communist side and they have a choice, that's a potential thesis. But to go from politics to look at Harry Truman and now transition to global, it just seems like a little too much for this at this point. An article writes about how, so this needs, give me the name of the article. Create opportunities for people, importantly, the policy of containment. Now they're talking about a specific policy, containment, which is interesting because they should have probably put containment here because they have one of the policies. Now they transition to organizations. So you need to revise this. I would say put containment and NATO in this thesis. I don't necessarily know then if that counts as a lasting impression, which means you probably want to give this a date. We want to probably talk about the post-World War II period going into maybe 1951 or 52. So these are some of the concerns that I have with this one. On to another topic, women. Women in the 1970s fought for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, so now we're talking about something specific. I know that the 1970s, we're talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. If this was the 1915, we'll be talking about the right to vote. So just by the way this is phrased already, I kind of go into my historical understanding. And I know, okay, this person has the timing correct. By women in the 70s, so they're not saying exactly which women. So again, I got a question. Who are we talking about here? Women in the 70s fought for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment by rallying and informing the public of important issues. Okay, so are they rallying or informing? These are two different things. We really don't have much to write about as far as length is concerned. So you probably can break this down into one section. Like you possibly could end right here or just talk about informing. Now, if you're going to talk about informing the public on important issues, like what are they doing? Are they taking TV ads? Are they doing speeches? Is there some sort of convention that the women are having? Like, I don't know. Inform the public of important issues like discrimination in the workforce, the wage gap, and strict abortion laws. Okay, so now we have a lot of issues with regard to some of these items here. So they start out with the women in the 70s, and they've identified 1, 2, 3 key issues in the 1970s. But then they also bring in this Equal Rights Amendment. Now, this could be possible, but we're not writing a book here. You know, this is a short response. So you want to think about how to condense this. And the way I would say to condense this, women unite for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment by rallying and informing the public. I don't know, like rallying and informing the American public, what, to support the ERA, and then you just stop. So that could be one potential thesis. Women in the 70s fought for the ratification of Equal Rights Amendment by rallying and informing. So we could probably then gut this and just say in the 1970s, these are the new issues that women were concerned with. So we have a couple of issues here with regard to this essay thesis. You know, I'm a little lost. You know, we basically want to be able to narrow this down. You know, if we're writing about the women in the 1970s, what were their issues? Notice they already have, as I've said, they have identified 3 issues. So they could really just dive right into this one, discrimination in the workforce, and talk specifically about what women did on this one issue alone, or this one issue, or this one issue. In other words, they just have way too many items that they're trying to address here. Anyway, let's keep going. The Equal Rights Amendment is a proposed, concern about our intent here, is a proposed amendment designed to guarantee equal legal rights for us, regardless of section. If the ERA had been passed, so if the ERA had been passed, I mean, I don't know if this is an op-ed piece. I thought this was supposed to be historic. It would have made laws that grant one sex different right to the other in the Constitution. So now we're getting into a summary of the ERA. I don't necessarily know that that's needed. You know, I probably would have liked to have seen a little more historic context. You know, tell me about the situation women are going through in the 1970s, and then give me some of those women that fought, you know, for this Equal Rights Amendment. In the New York Times article, New Equal Amendment adds emphasize work supports the UN support. One of the full-time servants realize every day how much discrimination exists in the world with low salaries. Okay, so now we have some evidence. So we have this report, and this acts like evidence. But what I would say with this evidence, I don't necessarily know that it's aligned with this. You know, over here, you're arguing that women, but we don't really have women doing anything. It's just a complaint. Women explaining what they did. So that's one item. Rallying and informing. Does this count as rallying and informing? I guess, but it's not really this woman informing. It's the New York Times, because the New York Times. So if you want to change this to say the New York Times published articles that talked about discrimination in the workplace, I would then say that that has a little more consistency. They stopped doing menial tasks, white men, while men predominantly took the more managerial and authoritarian opportunities. There were no way for the women to move up to the lack of. Oh, so now we're explaining what women went through, their experience. But again, the thesis is not about that. The thesis they're trying to write about here is this Equal Rights Amendment, or the rallying and informing people. So I want to know what women, specifically what women, what groups try to address the items that are mentioned here. So I would say it's just a little inconsistent. Let's move on. Hijacking complaints from America to Cuba that were done by men. What a minute. Men? Come on, there are women involved in that. What about Layla Khalid? What about Kirkhow and Holder? But they are saying in the 1960s. So, okay, I'm not going to challenge them too much on that. Anyway, hijacking complaints from America to Cuba that were done by men during the 60s were not acts of terror. Instead, some acts to escape their past in America to make a new life So I have some issues already. Act of terrorism, I don't know. I mean, if it's an act of terrorism, um, you have a political objective. So if they're trying to get to Cuba for freedom, then to me, that seems to be a political objective. And what they're doing is definitely putting the passengers in a vulnerable state of terror. So I don't necessarily know how I feel about this one. They're going to have to convince me. Anyway, so I guess what I'm in for is that some men in the 1960s, they're not terrorists because they simply wanted to do this. Anyway, hijacked planes during the 60s should not be looked at as an act of terrorism because they were used as a means to relocate without harming innocent passengers. Well, if I was a passenger on this plane, I would be concerned. So I would be terrorized. So I would say that right there, you have put me in a position where, maybe, how do you know? Did you interview everybody on that plane? Because if you did, do you have evidence that suggests that all of those passengers felt that they weren't terrorized? I don't know. Now we transition. The act of hijacking a plane was at its peak during the 60s and 70s. Okay, due to a lax government presence. Is this a separate thesis? Like, I don't even know why this is here. To push for a better security system. However, passenger flights viewed these hijacks as minor inconvenience instead of major problems. So this is an interesting point right there, and this could be accurate. You just need evidence. Give me a series of plane hijackings. Plane 1, plane 2, plane 3. All these planes were skyjacked, and all of the passengers on board made this particular point. And then I guess that might support the point here, but I would just use the definition of terrorism and say then it invalidates their concern. So there seems to be a lot of issues here that are of concern with regard to some of the information. This is a potential writing assignment, and so is this. This is due to the fact that hijackers do not intend to harm passengers. So how do you know that? But only to get to Cuba. So I would expect at this point, just give me a list of Cuban hijackings. Cuban hijackings. Give me the names of the people. Give me what they did and why they did it. And that actually could be another thing. What they did in comparison to why. How many people skyjacked the plane using a gun? How many people just used threat of violence and force? That would matter. This should not be looked at as an act because according to the FBI definition, criminal acts committed by individuals, criminal acts committed by individual groups are further ideological stemming from domestic influence, such as those of political, religious, social, racial, or environmental. So here we have the definition of terrorism. And so I would say here, if they're trying to make a new life or freedom in Cuba, I guess I see where they're going. I guess they're trying to make the argument that that person just simply wanted to move from point A to point B. However, knowing the climate of the United States during the Cold War, especially for this particular decade, this is going to be some sort of, communist motive behind it, even though it's not directly implied. You can read into it in that way. Otherwise, you need some clear evidence that suggests it's just about movement. And I don't necessarily know that citing the definition of terrorism really helps in this particular case. It is done with the intention of furthering ideological goals, but instead has the purpose of relocating the hijacker. Well, what does? The case that you're citing? Where's your case? So what do we have in your situation of this hijacking? Are you giving me a hijacking? No, it's just I have to take this for kind of face value. I would like to see a series of plane hijackings that were going to Cuba, why they were going to Cuba, and so on. So I would say you need some more evidence, some hard evidence. You probably want to structure this differently. As I'm done with these three responses, you really need to start thinking as a class about breaking down your topics and just focus on one. As I look at this one here, I would say just, you want to have one specific focus and probably stop being too general and vague. If you're going to tell me about plane hijackings to escape from their past in America, all you really need is probably about 1 to 5 examples of Cuban skyjacked planes or hijacked planes. Now, if you're going to talk about lax government policies, that is a separate within itself. Like, don't even bring this up or just write about that. And now you just give me a series of policies. Well, you could probably even use these hijacking methods and say, well, that is evidence of this lacks policy over here. So I'm just going to put over here, lacks policy. Now we're talking about passengers of these flights. And now we're talking about the passengers. And I think there's limited evidence as far as what's cited here, but that's a potential topic. And the only reason why I would say that is, my understanding of the passenger did become common, where people were kind of under the assumption that if a plane was hijacked, there's a good chance of survival. So I would say like they're right on that one. Now they transition into this definition of terrorism, but they really haven't applied it to anything. And that seems to be my concern on this one.